The personal computer, the smartphone, email, search, social media, electric cars, almost all of them came from one country, and much of them from one zip code. But that monopoly on innovation may finally be ending. So, why do some places become engines of innovation while others, with brilliant people, world class universities, and plenty of capital, never quite get there? I'm Lynn Toman, and this is Three Takeaways. Today, I'm excited to be with Mehran Gul, author of the wonderful and award winning new book, The New Geography of Innovation. He traveled to many of the world's leading innovation hubs to answer one question: why do some places repeatedly create the technologies that change the world, while others never seem to catch up? Welcome, Mehran, and thanks so much for joining Three Takeaways today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real privilege to be on.
It is my pleasure. You started by asking whether American tech dominance was ending, but you eventually decided that was the wrong question. What was the better question?
I think the better question was to look at how the world is changing despite the fact that it might still be the US that is in a pretty comfortable lead over the rest of the world. I think it's very easy to look at what's happening now and look at things like SpaceX, just making the biggest IPO ever, or the fact that America has now 9 companies that are worth over $1 trillion, whereas the rest of the world only has one. The entire world only has one, and to think that the world hasn't really changed all that much just because of American leadership at the top. But if you look at the second tier, that is almost all completely reconfigured over the past 2 decades. If you were to look at what are the most innovative countries in the world, or what are the most technologically relevant countries in the world 2 decades ago, that second tier would be almost entirely European. You would have countries like Germany, like France, like the Nordics in there, the UK, etc. But now that second tier is populated more by countries like China or South Korea, which plays a big role in high bandwidth memory chips, or Taiwan, for instance, which is a critical node in the semiconductor industry. Places like Singapore, which is responsible for the second largest sales of NVIDIA chips in the world, are to Singapore at this point in time. So it's easy to see the US on top 25 years ago and today and say nothing's changed. But what I'm saying, even if you concede American leadership, the map of innovation in the world has still changed significantly in the past few decades.
So interesting. I think that many Americans have a very narrow perspective and don't see what's happening in the rest of the world. What's the biggest misconception that Americans have about China's tech rise?
That it is copycat innovation, or they're not really good at the underlying science, where I think they would be surprised by how well their universities are doing in terms of rankings, in terms of quality research output as well. So I think that's the main misperception that I come across.
So, Mehran, take us inside Shenzhen in China. What changes in a person's imagination when they watch a fishing village become a global tech capital in a single generation?
I think I bring that up in the book in order to illustrate that we sometimes overemphasize the ability to produce technologies and underemphasize the cultural acceptance of those technologies. And if you look at the backlash against tech that has happened in places like the US and even the UK recently, things like people slashing Waymo tires, people vandalizing Tesla charging stations, for instance. Like, it's very hard to argue that there isn't a broad-based backlash against tech in the US. The sort of skepticism or cynicism that you come across about AI as well. The number of speakers at graduations this year who were booed off stage because they talked about AI. You see that less frequently in China, where, because places like Shenzhen have changed so quickly, people just see change as a normal state of being. And just because a technology is going to, wipe away some jobs, is not really dictating the direction in which the technological trajectory of the entire country ought to take, as it is taking in the US, where people are constantly talking about putting the brakes on AI. I think in figuring out which country is pulling ahead compared to others, we don't just need to look at their capacity to produce technologies, but also their capacity and their willingness to absorb those technologies as well. And in China and in places like Shenzhen today, you don't find the kind of techno skepticism that you see in places like US or even in the UK. When COVID happened, people thought that it was because of 5G towers. And in places like China, you don't really see those conspiracy theories about technology gaining that much traction. In China, they see tech as being the leveler, as the thing that's going to help them level up against, the US in specific and the West more generally.
Shenzhen to me is just one example of many, many places in China that went from being a poor fishing village, essentially subsistence level with people on bicycles, to now a tech capital. In the West, we often assume China's political system is a constraint on innovation. What did you hear in China that complicates that view?
So I actually hear the opposite in the West more frequently. So I agree with you that there is as strong a factual basis to say that the Chinese state is an impediment to technological development, as there is a factual basis to say that the Chinese state helps technological development in China. What I frequently come across in the US is people saying that these companies like BYD or Tencent, etc., they're doing very well because the state protects them. It's because the state provides subsidies, it gives loans, it facilitates everything that they do, that these companies have grown to the level that they have. And yet when I go to China, I see something very different, which is entrepreneurs who are quite concerned by the degree to which the state has managed to decapitate its tech sector. If you go back to 2021, Tencent was almost $1 trillion company, and because of state actions, it lost two-thirds of that value and was worth only about $300 billion, and it's managed to gain some ground since then. And that happened because the Chinese state decided that it's going to put some curbs on the gaming industry. And Tencent is a big player in the gaming industry, not just in China, but globally as well. And, we all know what happened to the IPO of Ant Financial, Jack Ma's the financial arm of Alibaba, which if it had made it to IPO at a valuation of $300 billion, would at that point in time had been the largest IPO ever anywhere in the world. And at the last minute, they managed to pull the plug on that. Companies like Didi Chuxing were hit with $1 billion in fines. I can give you one example after another. The entire edtech industry in China went up in flames because the state decided one morning that education ought not to be a sector for private profit making. So when I look at China and I talk to Chinese entrepreneurs off the record over there, they would often emphasize that they hear in the US and in the Western press very often people over explaining what's happening in China in terms of state subsidies or market driven capitalism. I personally don't think that the success of companies like BYD or CATL or Tencent or Alibaba can be attributed to state actions. I think quite to the opposite. If you can point to subsidies at one end, you should also point at the fact that they also get fined, their leaders get jailed, they get exiled. And so I think you need to balance sort of both perspectives. That's in some occasions the state helps, and in other occasions the state is literally responsible for sinking entire industries, which is also why you see so many Chinese companies re-domiciling to places like Singapore, because they feel that they would have more breathing room in places like that, with ByteDance, for instance, Hillhouse Capital, Sheen, all now re-domiciling to Singapore. And it's precisely so that they can put some distance between themselves and the Chinese state.
And what do you think accounts for the rise of China as an innovation hub?
So I think it's often the opposite of reasons that people give for why innovation happened in places like the US. So, in my book, for instance, I lean very heavily on Kai-Fu Lee to explain why China changed as much as it did in the past 25 years. And his attribution is really to this gladiatorial culture in the Chinese tech ecosystem of kill and be killed. I find that very hard on my sensibilities as well. But I think it's a fact that it's just come up in much harsher circumstances than the much more comfortable situation that Bay Area companies have come up in the past sort of 60 years, where there has been a lot of state support in the form of, how did Silicon Valley first come up? It was because Fred Terman came back from the Second World War and brought a lot of defense contracts with him, which laid the foundation for the semiconductor industry. And every other Silicon Valley company came from Fairchild Semiconductor, and that's how the entire place got its boot sequence. Whereas you can't really find that one event in China or one event in Shenzhen that birthed the entire region. Over there, the things that Kai-Fu Lee would mention are more poverty that stretches back generations, and people putting in that extra hour working 996 just because this is the one opportunity that they have to climb out of the generational poverty that they're coming from. So again, not the same sorts of explanations that you come across in places like the Bay Area or Silicon Valley more generally.
People keep declaring the end of Silicon Valley. Is it losing power, or is the rest of the world finally becoming more interesting?
I think for the first part, I don't think it's losing power either internally within the US or in the context of the world at large. And it might seem very obvious right now with, again, the SpaceX IPO having happened last week, with companies like OpenAI and Anthropic being the fastest growing companies in history, reaching $1 trillion in valuation before any other company reached those sorts of valuations. But if you go back literally sort of 5, 7 years, right before the AI boom, there were so many people making the argument that the value isn't what it used to be. And that's why I thought it was necessary to write that chapter and to devote as much time as I did to the question of, is the valley losing its relevance? Because if people like Alan Greenspan, who recently passed away, I quote him in the book, where he is saying that the creative destruction that set the US apart from Asian and European competitors over the past 100 odd years, that is not such a strong driving force behind the American economy anymore. And the US is now indistinguishable from its Asian and European peers. And there were pieces in The Economist, there were pieces in the New York Times that were saying that the valley, that entrepreneurship is moving to other countries, to other places within the US. And yet in 2022, with ChatGPT and all these major AI companies coming out, it's almost easier to make the argument that the relevance of the valley is on its way up, because historically all the great valley companies came from the South Bay. Google came from Mountain View, Apple came from Cupertino. These are not San Francisco based companies, but now the action has moved further up to central San Francisco, where Anthropic, OpenAI, Databricks, Y Combinator, all of them are now based. So the valley's importance to AI and tech in general is on its way up, not down. At a time when Nvidia, which is also in the valley, its market value is greater than the entire economy of India or Japan, for instance, it's very hard to make the argument that the valley is going anywhere. But I think that can be true. And at the same time, you can make the argument that the rest of the world is also rising in relevance. Like, both of them can be true, in the sense that 30 years ago, if you had Microsoft, Apple, 20 years ago, Amazon, Google, companies like that, and the rest of the world wasn't really producing anything at that scale. Today, you do have TSMC in China, which is central to the tech industry. You do have SK Hynix and Samsung in South Korea, where SK Hynix makes high bandwidth memory chips, which are a core component of all GPUs. You have companies like ASML in the Netherlands. You have companies like DeepMind in the UK. A lot of great AI research coming from Canada. So the absolute relevance of the valley could be increasing at the same time that the rest of the world is also showing up to the starting line and saying, we would like to compete.
So, what countries are we underestimating when it comes to starting and creating great AI companies?
So I think when we say AI companies, people tend to often overemphasize just one layer of AI. If there are different layers of AI, on one layer it's the infrastructure layer, then there's the hardware layer, then there's the foundations layer, then there's the applications layer. People often only look at the foundation models, GPT-5, Fable 5, and all of that, and think that that's all that AI is about. In that context, it is the US and China, because just because of the amount of resources and data and compute that it takes to build these frontier models. If you look at other layers of the AI stack, I feel like South Korea has managed to position itself very well, given the fact that high bandwidth memory chips are manufactured by SK Hynix. Some of the most competitive semiconductors are manufactured by Samsung. So I think that's a small country that's managed to make itself very relevant to the AI industry. I think a lot of countries that do not manufacture anything have still managed to position themselves as a gateway or a middleman in the AI industry. And the question today for a lot of countries in Latin America, in Africa, in Eastern Europe is, if you don't have the capital, if you don't have the talent, how do you become relevant to the tech stack? You have to make yourself relevant to some layer, whether it's the energy layer or the hardware layer or the infrastructure layer. And I feel that countries like South Korea, for instance, countries like Singapore, countries like Sweden, with a company like Lovable, which is one of the fastest growing AI companies in the world, their applications are built on top of Anthropic's AI models. despite the fact that they don't have the talent base or the capital, they've still managed to corner a certain segment of the AI industry that I think a lot of countries can look at and learn from.
Does AI make innovation more global, or does it make the strongest hubs even stronger?
My contention would be that it's the latter, even though the popular thing to say is that AI is a leveling force. And if you look at the statements by people like Jensen Wang and Sam Altman, they always say that AI is a leveling force and that AI is democratizing technology because the work of 10 people can be done by one person. But I think it's just a clear fact that making foundation models is not easy. You can no longer even make foundation models within the constraints of a university department. Like in the past, a lot of these technologies were incubated in universities, but today, if it takes at least $500 million to come up with even a borderline competitive foundation model, then how many commercial entities out there are capable of doing that? And that's one of the main reasons why, if you look at the entire European continent, there's only one notable foundation model, which is the ones produced by Mistral that are relevant anywhere else in the world. So I tend to think that AI is reconsolidating power among the two large tech players, the US and China. And then within these places, it is consolidating power within a handful of companies. Anthropic, OpenAI, Meta, Google. We just have this impression of the tech economy as a place which, you can just start a company in a garage and then go conquer $1 trillion market. But if you look at the AI industry, at least, it is striking how most of the winners of the AI industries are existing large hyperscale companies. Google, Nvidia, Microsoft. In China, it would be companies like ByteDance. Companies that in some form or the other predated the AI boom in general, and that's because of the amount of capex expenditure that is going into both the hardware and the foundation models layer of AI, and the fact that data centers are not that cheap to build.
For a founder or an ambitious young person, how should this change how they think about where to live, work, or build?
So I argue against the idea. When COVID happened, I read so many pieces in very reputable news outlets arguing things like geography does not matter anymore. This is the beginning of having distributed teams, and you no longer need to be in Silicon Valley, and you can build the next big thing in Raleigh, Durham, or wherever you might be based. And yet, if you look at the most consequential companies in the world, they're still coming from those handful of places. And not just that, the few companies that are coming from other places take no time to migrate to where all the action is. So even if Hugging Face, for instance, was born in Paris at Station F, it's now based in New York. And it's not as if places like Europe are not producing interesting companies, but they are moving very early in the game to either New York or to San Francisco. And I think that migration of companies and that migration of talent has gone up and not down. So I think I would make the argument that geography matters more. Being close to where the action is matters more because it puts you in front of where the capital is, it puts you in close proximity to talent. The only counter argument that I find slightly convincing is the counter argument that I came across in London, where some people told me that London is a better place to build AI companies compared to the Valley. And the reason is that a small company does not have any shot at hiring top tier talent if you're based in the Valley, because all of that talent is going and working for the hyperscale companies. So, a company is only as good as the people that work for it. And if all the great people are going and working for the places that are able to pay $1 million, $5 million for that talent, then where does that leave a startup? In places like London, that competition is less intense. And so you can hire people from Oxford, from Cambridge, and still be able to produce a globally relevant company. I think that's an argument that makes sense in theory, but in practice, other than DeepMind, which is now a 15-year-old story, I really haven't seen that many great AI companies come from London. And especially every 6 months, there's a new company being mentioned by people in the Valley. I haven't seen those repeat cycles in AI happen in a place like London. So despite the advantage of UCL, Imperial, Oxford, Cambridge, DeepMind anchoring the entire ecosystem, if it's still a second tier place to build great AI companies, I think that that's an argument for geography being more important, not less important.
So interesting that geography is more important. What are the three takeaways you would like to leave listeners with about innovation?
But the three takeaways would be it's not just about the US and China. I think other countries are showing up to the race as well, and it would help to keep an eye on what's happening. The race between the US and China is also happening in Singapore. It's also happening in ASEAN. It's also happening in competing on markets in Latin America, for instance. And I think it would be helpful to look at sort of these places as well. I think the second thing to understand would be that for a lot of countries, the gap between the US and China and them is increasing and not decreasing. Many people in the media frame what's happening today as who's winning, the US or China. And I think in reality, what is happening is the bigger trend is both the US and China really pulling away from the rest of the world and really opening up a massive gap between them and the rest of the world's economies. And I think if you're Brazilian, if you're Indian, if you're African, you might want to look at the past 8 decades and look at that and say the US won operating systems, the US won desktops, the US won social networking, the US won mobiles. And that created this massive economic and political inequality on a global level. If the next 80 years is going to be not that, but that multiplied by 10, and not just applied to the US, but China as well, is that an acceptable outcome for you if you're Mexican or if you're Brazilian? If you're American, that's a great outcome. But, I see close to nothing happening in Africa. A small fact, the largest company in Africa, a company called Naspers, is the largest company in Africa, not because it does anything in and of itself, but just because it owns a small chunk of Tencent. And so on the one hand, that's great for that company that they made a great investment 25 years ago. But what does it say about Africa that the most valuable company on the entire continent is a company that does nothing at all except owning a small chunk of a Chinese company? So the second thing would be, this matters, and don't be too invested in who's winning the US and China. The thing to keep your eye on is how two countries are running away with the next big platform shifts. I think the third one would really be try and find models of countries that have managed to make themselves relevant to the global economy in the new technological frontier, despite the disadvantages that they had. So, Singapore, for instance, it's relevant in the AI industry. How did it get that? South Korea, how did it become relevant? Places like Switzerland, for instance. I think these smaller countries have often figured out the solution to a problem that the bigger countries are still struggling with. To give you a very small example, in the US, it's always an assumption that innovation happens in new companies. And the way progress happens is that old companies die and new ones are born. And every generation, a new wave of companies replaces the old ones. So you go from IBM to Microsoft to OpenAI. And that creates a lot of disruption. People can't plan their careers. People at the grand old age of 50 feel as though they don't have that much left in front of them. South Korea has solved that problem. 100-year-old South Korean companies like Samsung, SK Hynix, Hyundai have unusual longevity. So I think places in the US would learn a lot from asking the question, how is it that Samsung was the only smartphone manufacturer that was a big deal in the 1980s when they were handhelds, and also in 2026 when the entire industry has changed and Nokia, Ericsson, and all of those have dropped off, but Samsung is the only one that's still relevant. So that would be my very long answer to what are the three main things to take away from this.
Thank you, Mehran. This has been fascinating. I really enjoyed your book, The New Geography of Innovation.
Thanks so much, Lynn.